Okay, so I think we can start. Many thanks to you for joining this session. I know that many of you will have sat through more than one presentation about open access today. So I hope that this session can give you maybe a slightly different perspective on the subject of open access, helped by the wonderful team I've got here. I should begin by making it absolutely clear that when it comes to expertise about open access, I'm no expert. I'll tell you a bit about my background, but we'll rely very much on our panel for knowledge and understanding. We're planning to, we'll kick off with, we'll introduce our panel, but what we're hoping is we have time for questions from the audience. So my name is Michael Upshall, and I'm here because I work with CORE, slightly confusing, C-O-R-E, which is a UK-based aggregator, global aggregator of repositories. And in a moment I'm going to introduce you to Kathleen, who works with CORE, C-O-A-R, Confederation of Open Access Repositories. So I've worked I'm relatively new to open access, but I've worked for years with AI companies and with on large-scale repositories, both working with publishers and with software providers. And the CORE, C-O-R-E, was founded back in around 2010, so it's been going for about 12, 13 years, and it has something like 40 million users a month, so it's a sort of very widely used resource. And earlier this year, CORE moved from a fully funded model to a partly membership-based organization. It's not for profit, but remains committed to open research. And actually, two of today's panel, Torsten Reimer and Kathleen Shearer, are members of the newly formed Board of Advisors of CORE. So the new membership model is institutional libraries, and CORE provides discovery and analytics and compliance tools for those members, as well as recommender tools. And an API for use by researchers so that they can carry out text and data mining on the CORE corpus. My role at CORE is community engagement, so my role is to learn more about the existing and the new members, the institutions who make use of CORE resources and from whom we harvest, and to see how we can help them better carry out their role. I was going to introduce the OSTP memo, but I should think anybody at this conference will know pretty much what that is. It's just about over 1 year old, and the goal of today's talk is to see, to compare and contrast what's happened in the UK, and have a little look about if we can learn anything from the situation there. So I think I'd like to start off with Torsten, because Torsten, I believe you were at the, before your University Librarian at Chicago, and before then you were at the British Library. So you've got a good knowledge of the UK and US differences, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how those differences work.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. In some ways, probably even more relevant than my work at the British Library was that about 10 years ago, I was at Imperial College in London. And this was just at the time when the UK made this interesting move to first appearingly strongly support gold open access through the author pays route and the publisher. And after the main funding bodies for research had just announced that, shortly after, the other main funding body that provides sort of the basic level of core research funding for the universities then confused everyone and said, what we are looking for is everyone depositing their manuscript, and not just when it's published, but actually when it's been accepted for publication. And a couple of years later, the main funding body for engineering and physical sciences then said, and by the way, we want all research data to be managed appropriately and to be made available for 10 years from the date of last access, so potentially forever. So about 10 years ago, the UK was in a somewhat similar position. There were a set of mandates coming through with expectations that the universities would deploy not inconsiderable resource to meet all of those requirements. And I don't want to say it's now as simple as to say, well, just repeat the same things that have worked in the UK, bring them to the US, and then our compliance with the memo would be addressed, because These are two very different countries, not just in scale, but also in culture and in the effectiveness of their funding. And also, obviously, because 10 years have moved on. But I still think there's some interesting lessons to be drawn from this. So I would say the first thing that was notable in the UK, that when the initial expectation was that open access should be delivered through the gold open access route, which at the time largely meant paying APCs for hybrid funding, the government mandated that and gave a target to, over a few years, move to 100%. But it did not provide enough funding to do this. What it set up to do was a sort of block grant where every institution in receipt of funding from these research funders would receive a certain amount of money, which they had calculated should be sufficient. And turns out it wasn't. We at Imperial College ran the numbers. Imperial College is an almost science-only organization that publishes between 10 and 12,000 research articles per year. If you take an average APC, you multiply it by 10 or 12,000, then you get a number that was higher than the whole block grant, the institutional funding for open access, and the whole acquisitions budget of the library together. And obviously the acquisitions budget of libraries does not just pay for journals, it pays for a range of materials that are unlikely to be open access, and therefore you could never move the whole budget over. Plus, in a hybrid world, moving your whole budget from acquisitions into APCs then means you're cut off from all the articles that are in open access. So the first realization that became clear very swiftly that it was, in particular for the research-intensive universities, there was no sustainable way to move to gold open access in a hybrid world. And as everyone was wrestling with that, then the next mandate came up. And I think what many, not all, but many universities did at the time is they focused on one very simple message is the moment your article is accepted, put it into the institutional repository, and it then becomes the library's job to make sure you're compliant. And that worked astonishingly well. I mean, there were some discussions at the time, are we making a mistake making open access about compliance because people will only do it because they have to? That's true. But we could also argue, at that time, we had discussed for maybe 15 years, depending on where you start the line, about open access, and it hadn't happened. And suddenly it did work. And the message was very successful because the libraries said the same, research officers said the same, provosts said the same, or pro-vice chancellors in the UK, and the funding bodies also said the same. And don't know what your experience is working with faculty. In my experience, they're very busy. They ignore lots of the central guidance, and if you don't tell them at least 4 times, they will tell you they've never heard about it because they get so many emails that the only way they get through the day is just delete most of them. And that when the email comes from the provost, half of them will read it, and half of them will not read it as a matter of principle. But if everyone has the same message, it suddenly worked. And the next thing that we also did, and with that I think I'll then come to an end, is in particular at Imperial College, our view was we should make the workflows as easy as possible. So instead of having 4 different ways of applying for open access funding, we consolidated everything in one research publication management system that faculty were already using. We built integration to other university systems to pull all the relevant data in so that this kind of whole thing of manually populating different forms all went away. And we just basically said, use the system that you already use, drag and drop your author-accepted manuscript into it, fill in 2 fields, and the library will solve your compliance problem for you. It will either pay if there's money available, and if that's the right way, it will put it into the repository. And in fact, if you give us your manuscript and you publish with a publisher that makes it available open access, as soon as that version of record is away, we'll take a copy of that shiny PDF and we replace your maybe not quite so shiny Word file with it so that you can be sure if someone comes to institutional repository, they get the version of record. And focusing on the workflow and focusing on the clear messaging, at Imperial College achieved in 3 years an increase of open access deposits by a factor of 35. And because the workflow was centrally done and we didn't leave it to faculty to do this themselves, that 35-fold increase in open access deposits, we were able to do with only a 3-time increase in terms of the number of staff, because librarians could do this at scale, whereas if you're faculty and you do it 3 times a year, you always have to remember where do I go, what do I fill into these forms. And it was really successful, and I had many faculty say, this is actually something useful that come out of the university centrally, and that's not normally the default. So my core message from looking at the UK is improve workflows as much as possible, have clear communication, and try to align the communication with all stakeholders across the university and the funding bodies. And until we've worked out how to make gold open access sustainable and equitable, repositories really work, and they're notably cheaper, and they're maybe not perfect, but they're a good solution. And this is, we are now also working on as much as we can at Chicago.
Thank you, Torsten. I can certainly second my experience of speaking to over 100 institutions in the UK. There's an amazing unanimity about every institution I've spoken to. The goal is to deposit all papers by all the staff in the repository, and no question that's what has to be done. And it makes things very, very simple and very, very clear. So Michael Levine-Clark is head of the library at Denver. Perhaps, Michael, you could start off by saying a little bit about how the system works and works at Denver.
Sure. As I think everybody here probably knows, there is no national level guidance about how repositories work in the U.S. And at a private institution, there's no sort of guidance beyond what comes from the institution. And my institution doesn't require or mandate in any way that articles be deposited in our repository. What it does require of all faculty is a sort of a mandatory reporting of their publications every year, right? They're supposed to fill in a database with all of the information about their publications. It keeps changing its name. It used to be Digital Measures, and then it was Activity Insight. Now it's something else. But we all have these systems at our institutions. Faculty hate them. They don't want to fill in the information. It tends to be wrong. We did convince with a sort of a compliance lens, but more about marketing and about communication and about rankings. We were able to get funding for a position to actually take over entering all that publication information into this system. Faculty like that because they don't have to do the work, and it's more accurate, and the library is deeply involved in that. Right? We're the ones who are running that process. The good thing about that is it's enabled us to sort of at the same time as we're working with faculty to get publication data into this system, we are working with them to get them to try to deposit their articles into the repository. And again, there's no requirement or formal expectation that they do that, but of course they want to do that, and if we can help them get there. So that's sort of where we've been. With the OSTP memo and with sort of stronger language around expectations of things having to be open, the Office of Research, the Vice Provost for Research, has sort of finally realized that that this is serious and that compliance is important, and that the library has a role, right? So the things that we've been doing sort of without any formal mandate, she's now saying to all the researchers, you have to start working with the library on making sure that you're complying with funder mandates, and that doesn't necessarily mean putting it in the institutional repository. It could be putting it in a funder repository. It could be a subject repository. And it could just be making sure that it's being published as gold or hybrid OA. But we're I think both because of some sort of this confluence of informal workflows that we put in place, and because now the Office of Research is taking seriously the fact that there actually is a compliance reason, we seem to be making pretty good progress. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. So I'd like to bring in another angle at this point, which I think hasn't been mentioned very much in these discussions about open access. And this is where I'd like to introduce Kathleen Shearer, who's the head of CORE, the Confederation of Open Access Repositories. And the new angle is not one repository, but many. Maybe, Kathleen, you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for that lead-in. For those of you who don't know, CORE is an international association. We are based in Europe. We have members from around the world. And CORE was really launched out of a European project to connect repositories in Europe together. And then, of course, at the end of that project, they said, well, wait a minute. Research is actually international, it's global, we need to connect more than just European repositories. So they launched CORE, and I think the vision is really important. The vision that we have is really important because it's really about the why of open access. And the why, is, of course, compliance, but the why is what can people now do with all of this huge body of open access content? And so what our vision is at CORE is that we have an interoperable global network of repositories that are, and interoperable is the key word here, so that we can bring that content together to start to build these really exciting value-added services. And that's really what we've been working on at the international level. So I think there are we don't know how many repositories there are in the world, but there are at least 6,000 around the world, and certainly over 1,000 here in the United States. So it's quite challenging to align, repositories, that many repositories around the world to try to start to coordinate and have a more cohesive way of presenting your content. But I'll talk a little bit more about that maybe a little later. And I guess there's a couple of other things I'd like to mention. One is that, we started with open access and articles are important, but we're moving from open access to open science. And repositories are ultimately the foundation for open science. Articles are the controversial thing because there's a whole commercial industry that's been built on selling articles. But in terms of all that other types of content, repositories will be the place where articles go. So a university investing in their repository is not just investing in compliance for open access, but in the future, in a way, of open science. So I think that's very important to mention. And then just sort of to reinforce what you both were saying, I think the only way to have equity in the open access ecosystem right now is to have repositories as one of the main mechanisms for compliance, because you just can't adopt a policy where 30% of the people in your country can't, researchers can't comply with your policy. So repositories are critical for those researchers that don't have access to APCs, but also we think that we can start to build some really exciting value-added services that may actually present an interesting and compelling alternative for researchers in the future if we can really organize ourselves in a more coherent way.
That sounds great. And perhaps we can come back to that in a moment. Can I go back to to Torsten and the contrast between the US and the UK? You could describe, one way of describing the situation is kind of a stick versus carrot, and I think it's pretty clear in the UK. It's sort of it's very much a kind of stick, sort of a compulsory system. Do you think there's no mention in the OSTP memo about how all this is going to be sort of enforced? Do you have any ideas on what would be a most appropriate system? Would it be would a sort of a stick-based sort of compliance method be appropriate?
A key difference between the implementation, the part that was really successful in the UK and the US system is that the way how funding is structured in the UK, every university receives a certain amount of sort of base grant from the government. And what the body that's administering this, and this is based on an exercise that will make many people from the UK groan. It's called the REF, and it happens every few years when universities have to submit a selection of their research, and they're going to be evaluated amongst different criteria, and ultimately that evaluation determines how much funding the universities get in addition to funding for students and research money. And what that body did is they said, we are only going to evaluate publications that are being made open access in the way that we'd like to see. And the interesting way, and from a policy perspective, super effective way of setting that up meant this didn't just apply to research that was government funded, it potentially applied to everything, because universities, if your core funding depends on that, they have normally teams that every time when the exercise happens, they strategize, they do data analysis, and they work very hard to find out what are we going to submit this year that make sure we score highest in the things we want to score highest. And they don't want to have the risk that someone says, well, this thing which we now know is crucial, but we didn't know 2 years ago, can now not be submitted because it wasn't made open access. So with one stroke, it basically meant that the university leadership wanted everything to be open, to have the most flexibility of what to submit. That's a really effective way of designing policy because it goes well beyond. Whereas and we don't know yet how the memo will be implemented. I mean, some federal funding bodies have given some indication, but ultimately we'll have to wait and see how they all will put this together before we have a clearer view. But it does only relate to the federally funded research. So at this point, my assumption is that the mandate coming from the White House is unlikely to be quite as effective as the mandate in the UK because it doesn't have that strong pressure to cover everything. And the universities themselves were effectively self-policing because they wanted to make sure that they could submit everything. So the university had a very, very clear incentive. Whereas if here it is maybe a member of faculty might not be allowed to apply for a grant or whatever the sanctions might be, that puts it back to the individual faculty. So my sense is the compliance aspect is not going to be quite as effective in the US, but hopefully, going back to the point that I made before, it's not always all about compliance. Sometimes it's about reducing workload for faculty. So if university is already using a system where faculty are being asked to record, if that system can maybe be somewhat improved and it can be made easier to, through that system, also make something open access, then I think by convenience, you will get a certain percentage that you otherwise don't get. So my sense is the US implementation, subject to what effectively the funding bodies will do, will rely more on the universities and libraries making an investment and improving workflows. But I would also argue 10 years later, that should be easier because technology has moved on. Repositories have become better, although if you still have an aging repository that a colleague customized 7 years ago and that colleague's moved on and you can't upgrade to the latest version because no one knows how this thing was programmed that you're now crucially using, then you are in a more difficult position. And that's certainly something that I've seen in many places. So I think that the key element in this will be how far we at libraries can use this opportunity to make the case that investment in good research information infrastructure across the university will benefit the university not just for open access compliance, but for getting better management information and addressing a whole host of other issues that the university administration also would like to see. And I'm hoping that with better technology available, repositories being more interoperable and others, we can sort of make up the gap where maybe the policy, I expect, might not be quite as effective here as it has been in the UK.
Thank you. I think interoperability is a key, which I think we can pick up on. Incidentally, we're very happy to take questions. If anyone has any questions, we have a roving mic, and we're very welcome to sort of take your questions on board. We hope to have a few minutes of questions at the end. If I can go back to, and again, I'm stating very clearly, I'm not an expert on the OSTP memo or indeed on the US situation. But one of the things that struck me is that the policy sort of suggested deposit of papers in a federal repository, but not indicating exactly which repository. So Michael, a question for you. The situation, sort of the landscape seems to be slightly different in that imagine this all goes ahead, it all gets sort of gets funded, papers are being deposited, but how do we sort of we tackle that one? How do we pick up on papers that maybe have missed the boat and didn't carry out the instructions?
Yeah, it's a really good question and a really important one. So I guess one thing of note, and I'm going to add another thing that sounds like core and core. Chorus has a dashboard that actually is designed to do a lot of that, and I should note that I'm on the Chorus board. But Chorus uses a dashboard that pulls in data from publishers, from Scopus, also from the funders, to sort of try to pull together information about where papers have been deposited, and where data sets have been deposited as well. And it's not a perfect tool, but it is and it certainly is going to miss some of the publications. But it is a way of trying to pull together from various sources information about articles, and the dashboard is specific to the institution, right? So we have a University of Denver instance of that dashboard that we use to try to track what's being published in association with these particular funder sources, and the degree to which there's been some compliance.
Thank you. Kathleen, a question for you is, you described CORE and the sort of the collective vision of multiple repositories. Do you think is there a collective role in responding going forward from the OSCP amendment? Do you think there is a collective role in meeting those requirements?
Absolutely. It's sort of a chicken and an egg thing, right? If the funders can't pass strong policies, if they don't see a partner to work with in the ecosystem that represents repositories, and so, then the repositories are less visible and so on. So I think it's critical, and we've seen that in other countries, that when repositories organize themselves at the national level and are able to have a representation at the table with funders, then they tend to be much more, included and represented and relied upon by those funders. So just to mention that about a year ago it was, I think, Heather, that SPARC, with the support from CORE, launched a US repository network. And really the objective of that network is to try to coordinate repositories in the United States to have more of a single voice, to be able to sit at those tables with policymakers and other types of stakeholders. And so I think that will be critical for moving forward. And we are at a time where we're just building out that network. It's a network that's open to all repositories in the United States. And so I welcome all of you who are involved in the repository ecosystem to please go to the SPARC website and sign up with your email and so on. And we'll also, as part of that project, be working with their CORE, which is a service. We are just an organization representing repositories, but a CORE aggregation service, to begin a pilot project to aggregate from a small group of US repositories to identify what are the issues with interoperability, what best practices should be adopted by repositories, and so on, so that the content in repositories can be visible both for tracking for funder compliance, but also for many other particular use cases and scenarios as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Let's move to some more general questions. This is one for everybody. I'm fascinated to learn more about repositories and what makes them tick. And one question I always ask repository managers and scholarly communications librarians is, what's the goal of your repository? What constitutes success? And looking at metrics for a repository is sort of, I think, sometimes a very valuable exercise. So let's put it to the panel. What makes a successful repository?
I would like to see the institutional repository at the University of Chicago hold a complete record of everything that our faculty and students have published. I recognize that in the global world, it's unlikely that we would ever hold everything, and quite frankly, we have folks who work in physics that produce data sets that are the size where I don't want to pay the budget for hosting them. But thankfully, CERN or others are doing this for us. So when I say a complete record, that doesn't necessarily mean that the object has to be deposited, but we'd like to know that it exists and where it lives, and so that if, I don't know, in 200 years from now, repository services at CERN in Switzerland would be switched off and the University of Chicago still exists, we could then say, oh, we believe we have 425,000 objects in your repository. Can we take a copy before you go? So I would like to have them all available. Preferably, I would like to have them all available with clear licensing information so everyone knows what they can do with the object. And ideally, that licensing information would be open and allowing the widest possible reuse. I'd also like the metadata to be machine readable and to be accessible for humans as well in all meanings of that word. And that all exposed well to whichever search engine or AI people happen to use at the time, so that whatever tools people are using, I recognize it's probably not going to be my library catalog, it's going to be something else, but that those tools can find the exciting research coming out of the University of Chicago so that it has as much impact as possible. And I would like to have all relevant persistent identifiers that exist applied properly so that we have good quality linked metadata that connects our outputs to everything else relevant that exists globally. So, easy task.
Yeah, so I think I'll answer a little bit differently. I think yes to all of that, and right. So yes to sort of preservation and long-term access to the University of Denver's research output, but I also think about the sort of about reputation and about communication and about marketing. Those are things that are really important to the institution, right? The institution cares a lot about highlighting our faculty and highlighting our faculty research. And to the extent that the library can play a central role in that, I think it's good for the library and it's good for the institution. It's bad for the institution and bad for, I think, the entire ecosystem when the university's marketing and communications department takes on that role, right? And they often do take on the role of sort of keeping track of faculty publications, but it's being done, in many of those cases, it's being done purely from a marketing perspective, right? And allowing the marketing to take place with carefully curated metadata and the content behind it is I think a thing that the library can do well, and it helps position the library in a way that's really important to the institution.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of you, and I guess I would only add, sort of to reinforce what you're saying, a first-rate service. I want a successful repository is one that is considered to be a first-rate important service within the context of the library operations, and I think that's not always the case. Actually, it's often not the case, so I hope that that will happen soon, as they grow in prominence, possibly given with a boost of the OSTP policies that are coming out fairly soon. And then I guess the other thing is technically agile, I would add, and I think that's another place where repositories could certainly improve their functionality, and that's also a sort of a chicken and egg situation, because if they're underfunded or if they're not seen as important, then it's hard to put in the appropriate resources to be really very functional and technically agile. So
that's a very good point. Yes.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Bryant with OCLC Research, and my question is, we've been talking about repositories, but and maybe Torsten, you might want to start with this from a European perspective, is that very often a lot of this aggregation of the scholarly record has occurred not in repositories, but actually in CRIS systems, or what we might more likely call in the U.S. research information management systems, because it's often the metadata only record. So do you have any additional thoughts on their use, and I guess interesting, their use in the US, because also, Michael, you mentioned your use of this digital measures. I can never remember the name of it either because it's changed so many times, which I categorize sort of in my research as sort of a type of RIM system, definitely, although it doesn't, sort of look like a European RIM system for sure. So just any thoughts there, I think would be valuable. I'd love to hear from you.
I can echo the challenge. Many institutions, the number of times institutions have said to me, I've said, "What's your biggest problem?" They said, "Moving stuff from the CRIS or the RIM to the to the actual repository."
Yeah, and since I really have been talking about digital measures, whatever it's called, in conjunction with our repository, right? It is not the repository, but it has proven for us at least to be a way, a sort of an entryway into the repository for many of our faculty, right? It's been a way for us to engage with our faculty because they are required to put information in the RIM. And I think that, to the extent that the library can play a role in both of those things, we should. It's right there at our university, the Office of Institutional Research manages the RIM, but we actually have a position in the library to make sure that the metadata are accurate and cleaned up and that works with faculty, right? And because of that, we're able to engage with the institutional repository, which frankly the Office of Institutional Research is not remotely interested in, right? They don't care about that. They care about the metadata, and I think it's our role to make sure that both of those pieces are in place. So I'll stop there.
I mean, I wouldn't say it doesn't really matter which system you use. I mean, I've seen implementations where universities use their CRIS or RIM as a repository. I've seen universities who have enhanced their open access repository to also act for the information management. Some of them I've seen use it successfully, just use both. I would argue the crucial part is that the systems internally in the university talk to each other, so that faculty don't have to duplicate the entrance, and that whatever is the faculty-facing interface is easy to use, and that preferably, as much as possible, you can point them to one place and say, all these compliance publications related to things we want you to do, go here. It will not look dreadful. It will already be pre-populated. And if then there's another interface for downloading the content also, doesn't really matter. I think you can make each of that work, but you need to have a good workflow and communicate it effectively. That to me is the crucial part. And then which system you use, if it's homegrown, if it's an existing one, that will probably depend more on the culture of the organization and where it is and what other systems it has. But usability and workflows are the two crucial parts.
I do think a role for both core CORE and COAR is what struck me so often is the lack of communication across institutions, sharing best practice. I was astonished that one institution said to me, we have real problems updating DSpace to version 6 to version 7, and the next institution I talked to says we're having real problems, and they haven't spoken to each other. This kind of communication, I think, can be really, really valuable. I think many of the problems are very solvable. It's just a question of talking to each other and sharing the issues. And I think, hopefully, you agree that core is that's one of the roles that core can play.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to your point, Rebecca, about like the aggregation, right, of content, and I think it's one of the things that we've been challenged with in the repository ecosystem because there are so many repositories, they're very distributed, and the value of that is that, they're based at institutions, they have operational funding from those institutions, and that way they're kind of sustainable. But the challenge is presenting that content, in a nice way and finding that content across all of those different repositories. And so I think, for me, there's a couple of things we need to do. One is advocate for the fact that some of the centralized services that are used for discovery, for example, Crossref, do not have repositories in them, and therefore that discovery systems tracking whatever should not be reliant on a single index of metadata content that usually is not comprehensive, but then also working at the repository level to make our metadata better, ensuring there are DOIs or PID, some type of PID and so on, so that we are more visible in those various scholarly indexes and discovery services.
I think we've got time for one last question, so far away.
Hi, Nadia Ortelt with the Center for Open Science, the Open Science Framework. You spoke about the measure of success of a repository from a kind of, say, constructive standpoint, but I'm wondering about impact and utilization. Do you have any metrics of success in terms of how that repository is actually being used by your research community?
Yeah, kind of a good point, actually. Does anyone want to take it? I mean, certainly for me, I think that's crucial. It's a little bit difficult sometimes to monitor that in an open access environment. For example, you may have your content that is downloaded, or aggregated by other services, and then that content is reused down in a downstream way. So certainly usage statistics are very important, I think, for individual repositories to show that the repository is being used. But I think there's also probably a lot of downstream use to things in repositories that it's kind of difficult to track. But it's a really good